Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Barron. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Aninawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Brown Tom's Schooldays by Enos Montour, edited and with a new introduction by Jane Logan McCallum. Appropriately enough, Jane will be discussing this new edition and the writer-editor relationship tonight with University of Manitoba Press senior editor, Jill McConkey. To give you a sense of how tonight will flow, Jill will be out in a moment to introduce Jane, and then they'll have a conversation, following which Jane will read a little from the book, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions as well. When this time does come around, just raise your hand really high for me so I can see you, and I'll come around with the microphone just to make sure that you're audible to those here and to the ones watching on the stream, because it can get a bit quiet in that section. And I will be back at the close of the event to review the signing procedure, but for now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's host. Host Jill McConkey has worked in scholarly publishing for 25 years, primarily in the fields of Canadian history, literature, and Indigenous studies. She is the senior editor at the University of Manitoba Press. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, and I want to thank all the folks for coming out tonight, and those watching online. I think there's a few McConkeys on the YouTube there. And I want to thank McNally and U of M Press, of course, for hosting the launch. And I want to thank Mary Jane for this book that we're here to celebrate tonight. Enos Montour's Brown Tom's Schooldays. We'll see later if I thank her for getting me to host this tonight. But I do hope it'll be a lively conversation about the book itself, and also about Enos's adventures in publishing and the working relationship that he had with his editors. A bit of background to our author-editor relationship. Mary Jane is the author of, among other things, Indigenous Women, Work and History, based on her dissertation, which I edited as a dissertation and again as a book. Sure. Structures of Indifference and Indigenous Life and Death in a Canadian City, and Need to Locate, Boys and Girls Work at Mount Elgin Industrial School, which you had some adventures in self-publishing yourself. And now, of course, editing this new edition of Brown Tom's Schooldays, Enos Montour's semi-fictional account of a boy's experience at Mount Elgin residential school around the time of the First World War. Mary Jane has a BA in history from McMaster and MA in Indigenous Studies from Trent, and she did her PhD in history at U of M. I have worked in scholarly publishing for about 25 years. I'm now the senior editor at U of M Press, where I've been for about 11 years. And before that, I worked at U of T Press, where I started working shortly after graduating from U of T with an English and Canadian Studies degree in the mid-1990s. In 2001, I left U of T Press and Toronto to come to Winnipeg and do my MA. And that was the same year that Mary Jane started her PhD. And I'll just take a moment to recognize Adele Perry, who was both of our supervisors, and introduced us that first day there as, to Ontario, newcomers from Ontario, who should have known each other slightly before that for the move.
Would have been good, yeah.
I could have shared my half-empty U-Haul with her.
My overpacked Hyundai was very upset with me
Yeah.
for the drive.
And I just want to take a moment here to acknowledge our presence here on Treaty 1 territory and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis, because this is a special place for both of us, I think. It's where we met. It's where we learned about this place together. We bonded over music, shout out to D Rangers, and food and history, because the history of this place and its peoples, this is a place where the threads of colonial and indigenous history intertwine and are also still palpable and present. As Adele has said, it's history that breaks your heart, but also history that bolsters your spirit and gives you hope for the future. And back then, this was all very new to me. I had high school history from Toronto. I had a Canadian Studies degree from U of T, and even the Canadian Native History books that I'd worked on at U of Toronto Press had not at all prepared me for the streets and the archives of Winnipeg. And I have learned so much from this place, and especially from you. You helped me to navigate a lot of that at the beginning, and still. And Mary Jane, you've always brought a personal passion to your work, and I've seen that throughout 20 years or whatever. I think it's been most evident recently when you've been writing about your family and community work. And I mentioned your academic training earlier, and I might add that Mary Jane was incredibly, I think, the first permanent Indigenous faculty member in a Canadian university history department. Which is crazy, right? And you now hold a CRC, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous people in history and archives. But to go back to the beginning, like, how has your family influenced your work?
Well, I'm a member of the Munsee Delaware Nation, and that's one of 2 Delaware nations in Canada. The Delaware originally from around the New York State, Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, but were early on encountered Europeans and were successively moved westward. And many Delaware ended up in Oklahoma. There are some in Wisconsin, and then there's 2 bands in Ontario, right along the Thames River, which is goes east-west, sort of west of London, Ontario. And so I'm a member at Munsee, and I grew up in just north of Toronto, so we have a very similar kind of area where we grew up.
I know Barrie.
North of Barrie, Ontario, a place called Oro Township, which is Anishinaabe territory, but thoroughly white settler.
Not that you would recognize or know if you were there.
When I grew up there. And my parents were both teachers, and they both kind of instilled a love of history in my brother and I, but I don't think it was all that hard. But they kind of taught us that it was important to kind of learn about the past, respect people from the past, and find out how you can use the past to learn about today. And with members of my family, including my brother and then a number of cousins, and my mom, yeah. We've been kind of studying family history for many, many years, and now more formally as a group called the Munsee Delaware Language and History Group. And under that umbrella, we've done a number of different projects, including the book that Jill talked about, Nidalog, which is about Mount Elgin Residential School from the era 1890 to 1915. And it was meant to be specifically for kind of grade 8 to grade 10s, because they're studying in elementary and high school, and their history curriculum is 1890 to 1915. So I wanted to direct, if at all I could, history curriculum to consider residential schools is not just a topic of Indigenous studies, it's also very important to Canadian history and this era. And so Jill obviously helped me out a lot with that book. My first and last, I think, self-publishing efforts.
You'll be working with professional publishers from now on.
Yeah, exactly. It's also a really interesting time to 1890 to 1915 is a time when my great-grandfather attended Mount Elgin. Mount Elgin was a residential school at a neighboring reserve. So if you could picture along the river, there's 3 reserves, 2 on the one side and 1 on the other. Oneida, which is a Haudenosaunee First Nation, Chippewas of the Thames, who are Anishinaabe, and then Munsee, which is Delaware. So we're all kind of neighbors and fight and marry each other. But yeah, so it has a kind of it's kind of drawn me in, this interest in the local history there, plus all of my relatives who are, you know, also really interested in history, kind of keep each other going.
And I think that Mount Elgin connection brings us back to Brown Tom. Do you want to tell us a bit about the book and the author and how you came across the book and what drew you to it?
So Enos Montour, who wrote Brown Tom Schooldays, probably over the course of his adult life, in small snippets, little chapters here and there. He was a Six Nations Delaware. So there is a small part of the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve that is a Delaware settlement as well. And so he's from there. And when he was, I don't even know how old he was, probably around 9, his mother died. And I think that the family kind of imploded. And I think we see a lot of that with the kids who ended up going to residential school. It was, you know, you're missing one of your parents, the other parent has to work to kind of make ends meet, and you need some help. And so many people turn to residential schools as a way to kind of have some childcare, hoping that the system would help them that way. So anyway, he went to, he was Mount Elgin at that time, and unusually, he finished, he got to grade 8, which was, you know, all residential schools finished at grade 8, but he wanted to continue. So he went to high school in Hagersville, so a public high school. He finished that, and a few years later, he ended up at McGill University, which is, you know, kind of unusual for the early 1920s. So he got a Bachelor of Arts there, and then he got a Bachelor of Divinity right afterwards at the Wesleyan Theological College, which was a United Church or Wesleyan Methodist part of McGill University that, you know, educated ministers in the United Church. He got that. He got ordained afterwards, and then he gets placed by the United Church of Canada in small towns in Saskatchewan, small white settler towns. And that's where he works for most of his life. He comes back to Six Nations. He works there for about 6 years, from the late 40s to the mid 50s. And then he moves back to Saskatchewan. He comes back to retire, you know, in his 60s, and he lives back in Ontario in Beamsville. And he passed away in the mid 1980s. So he has a really unusual and very interesting history. And so it already, you know, got me going when I started to learn about him. But I learned about the book actually from a reference to the book, Brown Tom Schooldays, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report. So it was a footnote or an end note in one of those, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And the reference was to Mount Elgin. I was like, this is unusual. So I didn't know of any, you know, school students' perspectives of the school history. I'd known about oral histories and some, you know, I'd read through a lot of the archives of Mount Elgin, but I was really excited. So I looked it up, and the only copy available was at the National Library in Ottawa, which is non-lending. So you have to go there, order it up during, working hours. And I read it there and I was just enthralled. Like, it was just such a fantastic document for me, like right from the start. And I just wanted everybody to read it. But I knew that that wasn't going to happen at the National Library in Ottawa. And so I started talking to Jill. I was like, what can we do? What can we do?
Right.
Yeah.
But I want to take a moment here to recognize the legacy of Murray Sinclair and the ongoing inspiration that he gives all of us. I mean, he, without the TRC report, we might not have Browntown Schooldays, for one, but also how the TRC has helped to shift so many Canadians' understanding of our past. And I mean, it was an inspiration for me in terms of, and when I was there in Ottawa for the release of the executive summary, and Murray Sinclair was such an articulate spokesperson, and released that report, which I read on the flight home, and immediately knew that it couldn't sit on the shelves like the Royal Commission had done from my undergraduate days. And so knock on the door, and Mary Jane, we kind of switched positions there, where I was working on the book and she was being that sort of editor personality to encourage and advise as I went along, and even came up with the title. But that changed a lot about Indigenous publishing and history and the way that we understand this, and opened it up to more nuanced and individual stories like Browntown. But briefly, let's back to Browntown on process. Our first step after locating the text and all of that, and then it was down to tracking down Elizabeth Graham, who was the original editor of the book, and we weren't sure how it had been published, until we talked to her. And then tracking down the granddaughters, I found one of them on Facebook.
Yes.
Facebook.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, and just bringing everyone together for that first meeting on how to do that. Like,
Yeah.
you want to talk about that first meeting? It was pretty cool. Yeah.
So that's a really difficult thing for me to do, to cold call people. And so I know Elizabeth Graham because I should show you her book.
Yes.
Yeah. Because she wrote this book, which is called The Mush Hole, and I know there are at least some people in here that are familiar with it. And she did it in the 1990s, and it's about two of the earliest residential schools in Canada, the Mount Elgin Residential School and the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. And so she has 3 parts in it. One is documentary, one is narrative, a narrative history, and then she also does oral histories with people who have now passed. There are no people who are still survivors of Mount Elgin. It closed in the 1940s. So, but so she's put them and made them available in this book to everybody who wants them. So, I knew of her, but I was a little bit nervous about approaching her. And then, of course, I was very nervous about approaching Enos's granddaughters, because I know if somebody asked me about my grandfather and, the way that I felt about their grandfather, I would think it was very weird. And so I needed somebody to kind of break that ice for me and make it so that it would be a little bit more normal than if I was in church. So Jill got in touch with the granddaughters, and coincidentally, they were thinking the same thing. They wanted Brown Tom to be more accessible, and they were, trying to think about ways of doing that. They knew it was very special too. And so we had this Zoom meeting, so it was still during COVID. And we all kind of met each other and started talking about what to remember to their grandfather. And it was,
It was such a great
I was
conversation.
held back about my enthusiasm. And they basically gave us the right, the permission that we needed to reprint the book. And then, we kind of came up with a way of communicating, and I needed to ask them a number of different questions about Enos that I couldn't find out. We all kind of
there were lots of stories shared, and that's where we kind of figured out, like, Elizabeth was going to be able to do that forward, to talk about her original relationship with Enos, and then his granddaughters would do that afterward to talk about him as their grandfather, right? And then you would do the introduction.
And I would do the introduction.
And it kind of set out those relationships and responsibilities. And as your editor, I know you're the first draft of your intro was quite different from what folks will be able to read here.
Yes, it is very different. So this is the tricky part of the editor-author relationship.
So how did your thinking about the book changed as you worked on it, and how did it affect your understanding of Montour? Enos?
Well, when I wrote the introduction, the first draft of it, I was in London, Ontario. So I had gone back to kind of close to Muncie for a sabbatical. And I wrote, I basically wrote how it reflected the history of that area as I knew it. So he talks about the principal, which I was so excited about. I had read so many documents by the principal and by other kind of white officials about the school. I got to actually see what the school was like, find out what the food tasted like, find out about actually how much hunger and food, took up the headspace of the kids who were at the school. I was very, very connected to this idea of the truth being told in this book, the kind of historical fact of this book. And I had completely forgotten that he also was, very intelligent and he was very literary and loved writing. And he was also using tools of literary analysis in his book. And I don't have that training as a background. I have the, let's read the documents, let's see if we can analyze them for something of the truth in the background. I don't have that. Look for the metaphor and try and figure out alternative readings for things. So what I presented to Jill read as quite boring, I think. And
no, I wouldn't say boring.
Basic, maybe? Is that what?
I would say missing a key element.
So anyway, and she like, this is the one great thing about having a good editor is that, like when the draft, she likes to have a paper copy so she can write on it. And when the draft comes back, it's so written on, it's grown in size, like the paper gets like, and it's because she's so engaged with it, right? So she gets excited and she'll put exclamation marks, but also
a little red line or copy.
Yes, a little yeah. And then these things, do you think he might have been talking about something else here? Like, do you think maybe there's a little more to the story that you might be missing? I mean, the title is Brown Tom's Schooldays.
That should be everyone's first clue.
He's working on
that this is a world that is upside down from what we all are expecting, right?
So yeah,
have we talked about Tom Brown's Schooldays?
No, we haven't.
No.
People know Brown Tom's Schooldays. Maybe you don't because it was popular in the late 19th century.
But Tom Brown's Schooldays
Yeah,
was
Tom Brown's
published
Schooldays, yes.
in what, 1857? Yeah, it's an
Thomas
English.
Hughes.
It is a classic of the English boarding school tradition. And just about everything that Brown Tom goes through, Tom Brown
Goes
also
through the
went
original.
through.
Yeah.
But Brown Tom goes through it in a very different way.
He's not at rugby school,
No,
and he's not, upper class elite.
no.
His school's run by the Department of Indian Affairs and the United Church of Canada
Well,
on a dime,
yeah.
not even.
And it was clear to me when I read the first draft of your introduction that the literary stuff was
it's not there.
Not there at all. And I think you kind of like wrote off his writing as, oh, it was the language of the day. And as an English graduate, I was like, no. And I knew it was a big ask at that time to, I think I said, you gotta put your lit crit hat on. And I think I sent you a link to Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. 1729 British piece of, but it's a primer on social satire and the slippery layers of language and literary illusion that adds so much to my reading of Brown Tom anyways. But yeah, it also took trust from you to follow that suggestion to go and find Jonathan Swift and to read it and to actually engage with
eating
it.
the babies, eating the soft.
If anyone doesn't know, it was a satirical solution to poverty and hunger in Britain, where the rich were to eat the poor, literally.
Yeah. But it did the trick. I was like, he's not talking about the truth either.
Yeah, and I think you did that admirably. I mean, you really were able to take that in and engage with it, and then it helped you to showcase the book not just as the historical document that you saw, but also you pointed ways, in a few ways at least, that other people could pick up the importance of the story and to identify its literary credentials that sort of general readers could appreciate and also literary scholars could follow up on in future.
And for those like me,
for the next PhD.
For those like me who don't get all of the many references to English and American classic works of literature.
19th century literature.
There is a glossary. On page 14, there is the phrase this, it is from this poem, it is from this story, and the Bible, of course. Lots of references to the Bible, lots of idioms and expressions that we just don't use anymore. So for those who are not as well read, this is here to help people at the back. Why the heck is he using this phrase? Because it is a little bit jarring the first time you read it, because it's not written the same way as any other book I've ever read before.
No, and it adds a lot of depth. Yeah. And I think that just goes the way that sort of worked out. It speaks a lot to the author-editor relationship of trust and mutual respect and things that we're each bringing to it. In your introduction to Brown Tom's Schooldays, you write a bit about the history of Indigenous publishing in Canada and Enos' experiences and relationships with his editors in particular. And when first planning this edition, you included Elizabeth Graham, Enos's first editor, or editor for Graham John anyways, from the very start. And so why was that important to you as part of this book story?
So I had read a number of sets of correspondence. So he didn't just write books and sermons. He also wrote a lot of letters. And so I had followed up on some of these letters, and they included efforts of his to have the book published by mainstream Canadian presses, including Gage and Dent, who had both said no thanks. And he also tried to publish it through the church. The United Church had a publishing arm, as well as like a film, branch. It was quite happening in the 60s and 70s. And so they also declined. And so he had spent, quite a few years knowing that he wanted to have this out there. But he was getting older. He had cataracts. He had a broken hip. It was very sore, and he had to go around in a wheelchair. He was living in a seniors' home for retired ministers, and he couldn't find a quiet place to sit. So it was really noisy. So a friend of his introduced, a mutual friend introduced the two of them. Elizabeth Graham just finished her PhD at U of T in anthropology in the late 60s. So very rare for a woman to do that. She's English, from England. She couldn't get into Oxford. She decided to immigrate to Canada to go to U of T. So she had finished, and she was writing this book on Mount Elgin and Mohawk. And so the mutual friend said, "Hey, you're writing about this history. Why don't you talk to Enos Montour, because he wants to do this book." And she agreed to, transcribe the book for him. And try to get it out there. And in the end, they just couldn't find anything. He said, "Okay, fine, just photocopy it and be done with it." So she went to a photo shop. Like at the time, we had these photocopy shops right in the 80s, where we got all of our stuff done, right? Maybe some people will remember this, right? And you pay a certain amount of money and you get copies, and she got a little binding for the edge, and she made enough copies for family members, which they distributed after his funeral. And so it's a good reminder that a lot of the great Indigenous literature isn't in fact published by mainstream presses. You have to go to archives and in people's basements to try and find this stuff, and there's all kinds of it out there. This, what do they call it? Gray literature.
Gray.
Yeah. Can't remember if that actually answered your question there. Why it was important to have her. Yes. So anyway, so she was this, and she was, obviously, I don't think she was paid to do this. She did this because, they had this understanding. He said, "You write the scholarly book, the truth about these schools. I want to write something of human interest. I want to get the human side of the story, and we'll write a kind of book 1 and book 2 together." And so that's how they kind of approached their editor relationship. He was very specific about what he wanted. He wrote to her and said, "Listen, tell me about yourself. Tell me what kind of degree you have. Tell me what you know about our history." She told him she had written a book about missionaries in Southwestern Ontario. He went and read it. He approved. He was like, "Okay, I like this. I like what you write. Let's do it. Let's get to work. I want you to tell me, you want to give me a schedule, mark up my stuff with your pencil in your whip hand or something."
I just saw that again today. It was her black pencil and whip hand.
Yeah, and whip hand. Like, get me into shape.
If that doesn't describe what an editor does.
Yeah.
He knew what he was asking
wanted,
for,
yeah.
and he wanted that.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And he, that was part of the amazing thing, was how he sort of vetted her, right?
Yeah.
That first letter to her, "Okay, so tell me who you are, what you've written, what you've done, what are your credentials for."
That's right. And so Jill and I had this long relationship already before we started working on books. They didn't.
Yeah, we were friends.
So he had to make sure she was gonna,
before
get things done.
more professional relationship. Yeah.
So-
they didn't have that.
Yeah.
So,
I'm looking at the time there, Jill.
okay, right, well, I think that's actually the last of my questions.
Okay.
So is there anything that you wanna add, or is it time to share a bit
I think
of
it's
Brown
time to
Tom?
share a bit of Brown Tom.
Okay, let's do
Okay.
it. This is my favorite part of the book. It is chapter 3, and Brown Tom is talking about the 3 worlds that he is now encountering, and it is just after his father and Uncle Joe have dropped him off at Mount Elgin.
Okay. So this is also my favorite part of the book, which is also handy. So instead of following Tom when he gets dropped off at the school, the story follows Tom's father and his uncle. So you get a kind of parent's perspective of having, brought your children to a residential school, which is a real interesting twist to telling this story. I also like this because it takes place on either Chippewa, the Thames, Oneida, or Muncie, and I think it happens at Muncie. So, okay, 3 worlds. Brown Tom was a citizen of 3 distinct and differing worlds. In coming to the institution that day, he had passed through them all. In later years, he found it hard to decide which of the 3 he preferred. There was, first of all, the world of the home reserve. The world was warm, secure, and not too sanitary. It was the world of his earliest remembering. It was one of whose influence was indelibly stamped on his psychic life. It would influence him all the years. Then there was the white man's world. It lay outside, vast, strange, and challenging. He had passed through it that day and was glad he did not have to stop. The air was a little too rarefied there. He was always more comfortable and at ease when he got back to the reserve from it. They meant well, these strange people, but they could not understand the inner life of a little Ojibwe boy. He would not try to make them understand. He would just quietly go back to the reserve. There, he would be understood and appreciated. And that, without a word being said, the very air on the reserve was different. The 3rd world was the present all too real one, the institution. No doubt that that world meant well to, but it was so uncomfortably efficient and put his romantic soul into a straitjacket of the daily grind. It was neither Indian nor white. It was half and half, like milk and water. What were they trying to do anyway? Trying to make white men out of the Indians? Well, they might make his body toe the mark and his mind grapple with their education. His Indian soul would go on dreaming as it had done on those warm evenings on the reserve. This 3rd world was a strange admixture of the 2. Brown Tom perhaps vaguely realized all of this the first night. It made him feel insecure and unhappy. It made him clasp all the harder the weathered hand of his brother Henry. Now Uncle Joe and Dad had no time for such idle speculation or analysis, especially Uncle Joe. They had somewhere to go, and they had to arrive at a comfortable time before supper. They were going to sponge. They were going to sponge supper, and they had to time it just right. They were going back to reserve life after stepping out into the glare of the white man's world. They walked away and sought shelter in a home on an adjacent reserve, probably Muncie. The principal had suggested that a clean, quick break would be best for the boys. There must be no lingering goodbyes, lest last-minute regret spoil well-laid plans. So the one sadly full of unexpressed emotions and the other quickly full of plans, they left the office. They knew that they would find a welcome at any home they might choose to visit. Indians from other reserves always find a welcome at these homes. More so if they know the local dialect and have conversational gifts. In the latter respect, Uncle Joe was quite accomplished. It was an old game of his to visit, or sponge, as they rudely called it, on other reserves. He was full of talk and stories, and that could be told from him well into the night. So while Dad was having his dark hour alone, Uncle Joe regaled the company with stories. He never really got into his stride until he held a knife and fork perpendicularly on each side of his plate. But even before supper was announced, he was well launched upon the subject of Indian rights. He could show all the mistakes that the British and Canadian governments had made in dealing with the Indians. He went on to show how the Indian Act could be improved. He even offered to make a trip to Ottawa if someone would raise the expense money. He was sure he could persuade the Indian office there to make the necessary changes. Although, he said, Indians are not treated very well, even there. Why, a bunch of us were there one day, and we were a fine bunch too. We came from different reserves. After dinner at the Chinese cafe, we went across to a park. With toothpicks in hand, we sat down on the grass just to kind of talk things over. We weren't doing no harm. Do you know what? You wouldn't believe it, but a great big policeman came and ordered us up off the grass. Imagine that, to think we owned this doggone country. Now they won't even let us sit on the grass. This home that they were visiting was built of squared logs, chinked with plaster and bits of wood. The room in which they were sitting was quite small. Light came from a coal oil lamp on a winged table with an oilcloth cover. The walls were papered with gaudy colored wallpaper, whose bulges showed that building paper formed a foundation. Mrs. Half Moon bustled around preparing supper for the unexpected guests. She fried fresh pork and thickened the gravy with flour. The potatoes were boiled with their jackets on, except for a strip peeled down each side. This gave the guests a start of the business of peeling before adding gravy. Then she got out the dried apple dessert and steamed the slightly stale pan bread above the boiling potatoes. All the while, she kept one ear alert to miss none of the wonderful tales. Uncle Joe saw to it that in these tales were references and tributes to the ladies. As the monologue went on, the wife found time to say, my, my. This she did without forgetting her many irons in the fire. Occasionally, she stood with the frying pan suspended while she addressed her husband. She spoke in the native dialect and remarked that Uncle Joe's stories bore out what they had heard before. Sometimes a question was directed to Dad, who sat in the half light behind the huge iron stove. He sat toying with a lacrosse stick, only speaking when spoken to. His mind was with his two boys in that strange new school. How could they get along? He cleared his throat and sort of shook himself before replying. Uncle Joe rarely waited for his answer before going on with the tale. At last, supper was ready, and they were asked to pull up their chairs. Of course, there was the usual protestations, and these are known the world over on such occasions. They said they weren't really very hungry. They'd eaten lunch on the train. Really, Mrs. Half Moon shouldn't have gone to all this trouble, etc., etc. To which she replied in the dialect, an equivalent of, oh, it wasn't any bother at all. However, they'd just have one cup of tea anyway. Uncle Joe's throat was dry from talking. And say, didn't Mrs. Half Moon's pan bread look inviting, all steamed through like that? That's what we used to call gungin bread when I was in the Institute, said the husband. This was the world of Indian hospitality. It was a world a bit like Lotus Land, where no one hurried or worried. Pan bread and pork gravy were always set out for the stranger, regardless of his name or tribe, so long as he came in peace. One could visit this way from reserve to reserve throughout the year. One only needed to be gifted, like Uncle Joe. Of Brown Tom's second world, we need not say much. It is the world of all nations and begins just outside the reserve. To him, it was a restless, stirring, and challenging world. It suggested the endless toil and endeavor of life. It was like the city world of dust, noise, and speed. Above all, it was a world of taxes, doctor's bills, and the ceaseless grind to make both ends meet. These were sufficient to condemn it in Indian eyes. In such a world, the philosophic Indian spirit could never feel at home. Brown Tom had seen these people driving along the reserve roads. In fact, they sometimes appeared long before his rising time. They seemed always in a hurry, driven on by some inner urge that the Indian could not understand. They had a little time to stop and chew the fat or philosophize about things in general. They only stopped their horses long enough to ask the way. Then, after some kind inquiry about the reserve and health and conditions, they urged their horses on. This was, of course, so different from the Indian way of life. Brown Tom had enjoyed the talk of his elders when their not too industrious work was interrupted by some chance passerby. It was as though they had said, "I'm going to work, but I don't mind being disturbed." They would sit in the sun and talk for an hour at a time. This was their life. No worry, no taxes, just enough work to keep going. The why and the whence and the wherefore of life could be threshed out to one's heart's content. These were their main topics. And the third world that Brown Tom had was that of the institution. It was neither on nor off the reserve. It was the sanitary, disciplined, and well-ordered. It was not just now coming up before the two boys. Its invitation did not appeal to them very much. But for better or worse, they now lived within its walls. Their names were on its roll. They would just have to make the best of it. Perhaps, if they watched closely, they might get a chance to run away one of these days.
Thank you. And yeah, I guess time for any questions. Hold on a second. Oh, we need a microphone.
I'm too excited. The glossary, is that something that Enos Montour created, or did you generate that? And what was that like?
So it was, yeah. There were a lot of parts that, he put some things in quotes. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And so that I was like, okay, so this is from something. I got to find out what this is from. What's that story about, and what is he alluding to here?
I noted a couple of.
Yes, and so did Elizabeth.
And
so Elizabeth
yes.
did a lot of them too. But that is, in doing that, I realized that many of the poems he was using came from Ontario readers of the same era that he went to school. So very likely the Ontario curriculum that was used in Mount Elgin's residential school. So he would talk about, isn't it funny that we learn poems in the spring about the springtime, and in the fall time we learn, poems about the fall, and he would cite those same poems, and they'd be in the index of those old Ontario readers. So yeah, you can kind of see the the thinking there. He's pulling out his education right before our eyes as he's telling us about this. Yeah.
Well, you have to know it before you turn it on its
That's
head.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that copies of the book were originally circulated at the funeral. I'm curious about the granddaughters and the relationship to the book. How is it referred to in the family? What did they do with it for all those years between the funeral and your first meeting?
Good question.
Yes.
Yeah, so
we'll
they
have
would
to
have
ask
been-
them next week.
Yeah, we will
more,
ask
but
them next week. We're gonna see them. We're gonna do a launch at the Woodland Cultural Center, and they have obviously family at Six Nations, so they're gonna all come out for it. But they were young, I think. So it would have been their mother, and their mother was the one who was
Shirley.
Shirley, who had,
Who signed
Yeah,
it,
who
that's
signed
how
it,
I
yeah.
was able to track it down
Exactly.
from her inscription on the inside page.
they primarily knew him as their grandfather, and didn't sort of know all about his, his interest in writing until they were adults. There was discussion
They
of
knew
a,
about this book.
they knew about the book, yeah, and there was discussion of a suitcase of all of his writing and images. That
Which
was,
I
that
hope
was
they
located
bring
in
to the Woodlands.
Saskatchewan.
I hope,
Yeah.
I hope they.
I asked, but I did not get access to that suitcase. But I have a feeling that they know very well the value of their their grandfather and his work.
So the book that's given the family members at his funeral, did he in his lifetime know that it was going to get published?
Yeah, I asked Elizabeth that same question because I said the dates don't match up here. It seems like he died before, the date of the photocopies, and she said no, he saw it before, and he said okay, it's good to go. You can photocopy it. Yeah. And he had also published some of these stories in the United Church Observer. And in other places, he wrote for the Hamilton Spectator and the Regina Leader Post. And so, he had gotten some of these stories in earlier versions out there before too. Yeah.
So was the church school run by the United Church of Canada or the Methodist Church of Canada?
First the Methodists. So it opened in the 1840s, or maybe actually 1850s, by the Methodists. And then when the United Church was formed in 1925, it was run by the United Church of Canada and the federal government, of course.
Can you tell us about any of the communities, the names of the communities in Saskatchewan where he?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, I can. I actually had two maps made. One of the kind of eastern communities that he was in, and then one in the western part. And so Goodwater, Colgate, Ceylon, Capel. No, Capel, he wasn't at Capel, we just used it as a marker there, sorry. Moose Jaw, Pontiques, Ponteix. Pontiques. Is that right? Aneroid, Elrose, Hawarden, and St. Walburg. So St. Walburg's a little bit further north. Yeah. So I was curious, yeah, like those are unanswered questions. Like, why Saskatchewan? So I don't know. When he applied to work at his home church, which was the Chapel of the Delaware at Six Nations. And when he did move back to work at that church, he lost his seniority within the United Church of Canada. And so then he was back at Ground One when he went back to Saskatchewan. So, sort of odd. But that's a whole different record set to the United Church of Canada archives that I'd like to know more about.
Hi. So, and congratulations on the book. So I think we'll all learn this once we read the book, but just for now, you mentioned that he basically has used Tom Brown's Schooldays as kind of, sounds like sort of the model for the book, and then he's rewritten, is that it? He's kind of rewritten the scenes, but made them into residential school experience. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah. So I didn't read Tom Brown's Schooldays as a young person or an old person. I read it after Jill told me to read it, after my first draft of my introduction.
You're gonna have.
So to me, I was like, I don't see it, because I'd read it the other way. So, he has a story about the barn fire that happened in 1915 that, destroyed two of the barns at the school and a lot of the livestock, and was likely started by arson, and was, the person who was, charged with that spent many years at Kingston Penitentiary, like way overcharged for this. But I knew that from the records, and I knew that from the kind of Mount Elgin context. There was also the death of a boy from tuberculosis, And that I knew from my other research, and I just couldn't see that, you know, being paralleled in Tom Brown's Schooldays when I was reading it. And yeah, it is a real mid-19th century type of book. Like it's
English.
I needed like I needed a translation to kind of get through it. So I didn't see it, but I think if somebody knew that book, they would see it. There's like bullying and, you know, and then, you know, it's really a story of the child turning into an adult, right? And then, you know, struggling, but then becoming, you know, a great citizen in the end. At the end of this book, you know, he also says, I wanna stick with the books. I wanna go to school. And he says, but when he leaves Mount Elgin, there's 2 lions at the gate. One, like the serious self-doubt that was instilled in him by the teachers and the, you know, the staff at the school. And then the second was the supreme prejudice of the world outside the school that was going to be what he'd have to confront, right? He'd have to decide Indian or white. That was never part of, you know, Tom Brown's, you know, growing into an adult. So yeah, so I see it a little bit differently.
Sophistication of literary,
exactly, yeah.
bringing that literary analysis a little bit, where you see what Tom Brown's Schooldays did, but then how Enos turns that on its head in just about every way, while still following the kind of literary illusions and form of that, very British boarding school
Very British
experience, without sharing that at all.
But I mean, so was Mount Elgin at the time. All the staff were
Oh, yeah.
British. They were not, you know, Canadians. They were there's an Irish principal who's Reverend McVitie. The stockman was from Scotland. The matron was English. So I think it was pretty normal for that kind of, there was a lot of, you know, Anglo settlers in southwestern Ontario, but I think they wanted to have that at the school, this kind of English influence. So
that was one thing about Grandchild's Schooldays, is he makes so clear how many different nations are all coming together at that school. The kids, the teachers.
but it's a very different place, you know, in the 30s and 40s. It's completely different.
I think we're 8:03, so we're getting pretty close. Do we have any other?
Thanks, Mary Jane. It was amazing. Thank you so much. The passage that you read was so interesting because, as you say, it's focusing not on the main character necessarily. It was in the third person. I'm just wondering if the rest of the text is in the third person, and if it is, I guess, what your thoughts are about that as, you know, a life story or influenced by a life story in this day and age.
There's a lit question for you.
Great question. That is a
You wish you'd cut it off.
Thank you. Yes. And I know that we both acknowledge the importance of Winnipeg to like our creative process and the kind of work we do as well. So yeah, he talks about Brown Tom as an Ojibwe boy, not as a Delaware boy. He's made up the name. Henry has a pseudonym. All of his friends at school, I think all of them have pseudonyms, although they borrow names from the area. I don't know whether he was doing this to disguise people, to have a little bit more freedom in saying what happened or interpreting what happened. I've struggled with this too, like who exactly was he writing for? So was he, and Jill thinks he was writing for like a white population that had read to him.
No, I think he was writing for everyone.
For everyone, yeah.
For
yeah.
everyone.
But I had thought it was an older generation of Indigenous people who had gone to residential schools like this, that would get this humor, that would get like, he was trying to be smart with his, you know, references and his, you know, his knowledge of the English and American tone. But yeah,
but he was trying to get it published by more mainstream and educational publishers. He was not, he wanted that out for everyone to read, you know? And
but yeah, he said did he say semi-fictional? I think I said semi-fictional. He said kind of light on the truth. like, or something like that. He was, you know, he was a storyteller too, but just that you could connect a lot of the characters, and some of the characters got their real names in that story too. He wanted to call the book not Mount Elgin, in the story he calls Mount Elgin, but he wanted to give it a pseudonym, and he wanted to call it after the name of the last principal there, who was Elgie Joblin, this guy that he really liked, who was another, you know, he was a missionary from the church. He said, we want to call it Mount Joblin. And he asked his friend if he could do the user sign. You know, people are starting to talk about like things like, you know, torture chambers and you know, like dungeons in these institutions. I don't want to have, you know, I don't think it's a good idea to do that. So he said, well, what about the principal before you? That was Principal Strapp. And Principal Strapp was a completely different principal than Elgie. He was like horrible guy who ended up
Lived up to his name.
Yes, people complained about him, and the church, instead of, you know, firing him, they moved him out to Brandon Residential School here, right? But I was like, so it doesn't really matter to him. He's kind of like Mount Elgin, you know, Mount Strapp, Mount Joblin. I don't know exactly, but I think it was probably just to give him a little bit of license to, you know, or maybe like allow him the space to tell it. Maybe, you know, it's a little bit distanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a good question.
Alrighty. Thank you both so much for that. Before we close the night, was there any closing comments that either of you wanted to say?
Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Mary Jane.
Alrighty, well, that brings us to the signing portion of the
And thank you,
evening.
everyone.
Yeah, I think thanks.
So please feel free to approach the signing desk to my right. You feel free to get your book signed before paying for the book. So long as you pay for the book, all is well.
Yeah.
Thank both of you again so much for this. Thank all of you for your being here and for your questions. And of course, to those of you on this stream. And have a wonderful night. Yeah. Thank you.